My name is Grace Howard. I'm an associate professor of justice studies at San Jose State University.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're talking about your book that just came out this year, The Pregnancy Police, Conceiving Crime, Arresting Personhood. So if you could talk to us a little bit about how you came to this topic and why you wrote the book.
Sure. So I am somebody who has been passionate about social issues since I was like a kid. And I considered myself really involved and really aware. And doing all of this different kinds of like intersectional work, right? Like Food Not Bombs and writing letters to incarcerated people and helping people get HIV tested in college. And I didn't know that the criminalization of pregnancy was a thing until I was in my PhD coursework. And that fact alone, like, really bothered me because it seemed so obvious to me that the criminalization of pregnancy brings together all of these like major issues that I care a lot about and that I think a lot of people care about, but they don't hear about this. So like, why are we not hearing about it? And what actually is going on were questions that I had about this. So I was doing my coursework with my PhD. She ended up being my dissertation chair. Cynthia Daniels was teaching a public policy course, and she introduced us to this subject. She also introduced us to someone who has been working on this issue for a long time. Her name is Lynn Paltrow, and she founded a legal advocacy organization that was called National Advocates for Pregnant Women. It's called Pregnancy Justice now. They just changed their name. But yeah, these are the things that really, like, I decided I wanted to learn more about this, and I wanted to make sure other people knew. There were a lot of really great like law review articles about this, where they, maybe even zero in on a specific case, but there wasn't a lot of data at the time, right? It was hard to really get a full picture of like what is happening. And so that's something that I was really motivated to do, was to try to bring some of this legal theoretical conversation to the data and like really figure out what's going on.
Yeah, and did you actually did original research for this book, correct?
Oh, yes, a lot. Yeah, I worked on this book for such a long time. And so some of the original research that I did, and for some political scientists, they can just look up a data set that already exists and use it. And, that just doesn't exist for this project, unfortunately. So I had to build data sets. I looked up every introduced piece of legislation in the US, in the states, and at the federal level from 1973 through 2022. I did interviews with prosecutors that I coded and analyzed. And then the big piece was analyzing its 1,116 arrest cases where pregnant folks were charged with crimes against their own pregnancies. That was a tremendous undertaking, just identifying cases and then finding documents to understand the cases. So sometimes you're working with, I don't know, like a 3-sentence article from a local news blotter. And like, I have to find out, who this person is, what happened, where, who's involved. So I coded those cases for a bunch of different things. And then I also wrote narratives for these cases. And so one of the things I really wanted to offer in the book was, yes, data, but also the stories, right? So I can tell you this broad view of what's happening, but then I can also tell you, like, here's what happened to this one person and what it looked like for them. I thought that was really important. I think the victims in these cases, the folks who get arrested, are so often overlooked. And we really need to be centering them in this work.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things that struck me is well, there are two things. One is, in the background of all of this is our recent overturning of Roe v. Wade. And it's hard not to read your book with, because most of it does deal with before Roe was outlawed or overturned, I guess. and how the implications of what you're talking about being extended into now a criminalized abortions framework. But then secondly, how, and I think this is probably where the crux to your book is this idea of separating mother from fetus. So putting them at odds, where a pregnant person's behavior or activity is seen as hurting another person who happens to be a fetus inside the other person. So I would love for you to deal with that second question first and
Sure.
kind of tell us how this relationship started to evolve.
Sure. So, yes, this is a concept that we refer to as the maternal fetal conflict. And it has been, I would argue, so normalized by the anti-abortion folks that a lot of folks, they just like, yeah, of course, that's what it is. And like, that's one way of looking at it. And there are a lot of other ways where you could look at it too. And what I see it is more of a continuum, right? Of like, yeah, the thing you're growing in there will be a person at some point. And you're a person too, and you have been, and I hope you continue to be, is my hope. So yes, the maternal fetal conflict is the idea that the person who is pregnant and the thing that they are gestating are both persons. They both have interests, and that those interests are in conflict with one another. And then typically the political element that we insert in there is the thing that's being gestated as a person is the more innocent and deserving person. Always, right? By the matter of the fact that like this entity has not yet been born, and so they've literally never done anything, right? And at the very least, the person who's pregnant has almost definitely had sexual intercourse at least once, and we know it's bad when women do that, right? The sexism is all over it, right? The reason why you can't separate these two things is because they are not separate. I mean, they are quite literally connected physically, bodily. And there is no, I mean, any point you could pick in a pregnancy where that personhood starts is like pretty arbitrary, really. I mean, we all have different way culturally around the world, we all look at it differently too. So, is this baby a person when it's born? Is it a person when there's a pulse where the heart thing will one day be? Is it a person when they turn 1 year old and have survived, and that is when they get their name, right? I mean, there's so many different ways of looking at it. You cannot have fetal personhood and the maternal fetal conflict without taking the personhood away from the pregnant person. You just can't. It's not possible. And I will meet people where they are. If they say they believe life begins at conception, like, I disagree. Sure, let's go with that. Life begins at conception. Since when have we allowed persons to use another person's body against their will? We call that indentured servitude. And it's not supposed to be allowed. Okay. Right? And the comparison that we could do is, let's say I'm the worst person who's ever lived. And let's say there's like the most innocent, perfect person over here. And that person needs my kidney and they'll die without it. Can they take my kidney from me? I'm the worst. Can they take my kidney from me? And the answer is no. We're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to. Now, it would be nice for me to give my kidney, maybe, but like, is the government going to force me to do it? So we just have this different standard that has been built up for folks who are pregnant, and it comes from that concept, that conflict.
Yeah, and I want to build that concept up and how that differentiation is reflected in the law and the cases you looked at. But I think one of the first places to start will be murder. So if a woman is murdered by her partner, let's say, the father of the baby, and she's pregnant, the law wants to and probably has a vested interest in seeing two victims of that crime in order to enact the maximum punishment for murder. It
Yes.
seems like most people will be like, all right, I get that. But then it
Yeah.
becomes, there's this shift somewhere along the line that starts punishing the pregnant person for their behavior. And it's a
Yes.
third party harm kind of thing. And let's talk about that, those two relationships.
Yeah, I mean, so I would consider myself a feminist, right? I care very deeply about violence of any kind, but especially violence against women. We know that this is a major problem, and like horrifying fact, especially when you consider that we're taking the right to abortion and some people are trying to take away the right to contraception. The time in a woman's life when she is most likely to be murdered is when she is pregnant, and pregnancy homicide is like a leading cause of death among pregnant women. We've only counted it for like cis women ever, so that's why I'm using that term. um, so we know this is a major problem, and it is usually the intimate partner. I mean, we always joke about like the husband did it. It usually is the father of that pregnancy, right? um, and so, being the punishment oriented society that we are, when somebody does something bad, the way that we deal with it is by punishing people. And we do that by putting them in prisons and jails. And sometimes we kill them. Um, or sometimes we just surveil them very closely for a while. And so, yeah, if you have this horror of someone who is usually carrying a wanted pregnancy, who is murdered, that we want to see some kind of extra recognition for that horror, that like this is different than, if a non-pregnant person is murdered, that there's like something more happening there. I get where that comes from. But yeah, states pass laws often based on these really notable, horrible murder cases. And these cases almost always feature like a middle class white woman, right? Lacey Peterson comes to mind, right? And there was actually a federal law named after her and her Connor, right? The baby she was going to have. So we're going to protect these nice ladies who are like presumably doing everything right, and they just seem very lovely. And that creates a precedent in the law where we have now established fetal personhood in the criminal code. And I get the idea that you think we can isolate it and only use it for like the abusive boyfriends and the pregnant person murderers, but that's not what's happening. That's just not what's happening. If you have one of those laws on the books, it becomes so much easier to start prosecuting folks who are pregnant for crimes against their own pregnancies. So we have to protect these nice women over here. And while we're at it, we're going to go ahead and punish these nasty women over here. They use drugs. They don't care about their babies. They're bad women. They're not doing it right. That is unfortunately where we are in the law. 38 states and the federal government define a fetus as a crime victim in their criminal code. And it could be more. States are interested in exploring that. So it's the peril of protection, right? I mean, we've seen this historically, like the government wants to protect you. And also, what's the price that you'll pay for that? Like, at what cost does this protection come? Your legal personhood? I don't know if I'm into that trade.
Well, and it also plays into kind of the work that Angela Davis and her cohort are doing around the carceral society, and how, we as a society don't do anything positive unless there's some sort of back channel to punishment. And
Yeah.
we'll talk about that when we get to the drugs. But I want to build up how further evidence of pregnant people's persecution, which is hard to say fast 3 times, but
The alliteration.
um, but you deal a lot in the book with eugenics and sterilization, and I'd love for you to talk about what you found and why it's included in the book.
Sure. And so this is another, like, man, I wish everybody got to go to grad school if they wanted to. Because, yeah, I didn't know about this either until I was doing my PhD coursework. I grew up in the South. I had city parents they grew up in and around DC, and they had 2 kids, and they moved to the country so that they could afford like a yard to put us in. And so that was an interesting dynamic of like city white people versus country white people. And as a family that for a lot of the time growing up, we were pretty poor to working class, I would say. And then I go to grad school north of the Mason-Dixon line, right? And I'm like, oh, wow, like I feel like most of these people here were raised way fancier than me. And just this like interesting dynamic of what do the quote unquote college elites of New Jersey have to say about, working class Appalachians was sort of the vibe, and was thinking about that a lot. And I started reading more about sort of the historical construction of poor white trash being the term as it's constructed anyway. And I found that, yeah, one, eugenics didn't just start in Nazi Germany. Eugenics was incredibly popular in the United States. The Nazis actually said we were beating them at their own game. At one point, they gave awards to some of our eugenic scientists. And for those of you who don't know what eugenics is, it is the idea that social traits are heritable. And so basically, if we want to get to utopia, all we have to do is be very selective about our breeding. Right? Because then if poor people can't have babies, they won't be spreading their poverty gene, and then we won't have poverty anymore. How great will that be? You have to put that then in the context of some of the panics that were happening in the US around that time. So industrialization changed so many things about family life. The girls were leaving home before marriage and like going to work in a factory in the big city and earning a wage. That was something new. We also have, during this period, late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of immigration on the West Coast from China, on the East Coast from Southern and Eastern Europe during this period. And the Anglo-Americans were totally freaked out about that too. This idea exists today. It's called the Great Replacement Theory. And it is this idea that white people are being outbred and that we have a problem with that. Like to separate those two things too, because like, who cares? There's not enough sunscreen in the world, frankly. So how do we deal with this problem? White girls are going to the cities and getting jobs and earning wages. They're not having as many babies as they used to, a natural thing that happens with industrialization. So how can we force white women who deserve to reproduce to have more children? And how can we stop those raggedy white people on the fringes from reproducing? If we're going to shore up the strength of the white race, we can't let these poor white trash reproduce, right? They're like seemingly biologically degenerate. And so, yeah, in my home state of Virginia, they were big into this. And the big eugenics case that went to the US Supreme Court came from my home state. It's called Bucky Bell. This was in 1927. And this was about a girl named Carrie. Her mom's name was Emma. She had 3 children. Who fathered those children? Records from this time are not great. It seems that she had at least one of those children out of wedlock. One of the men, I think, died and another abandoned her. So she was in a hard way, right? She's in the country. It's 1920 something, and she's got these kids. She was a street sex worker, a survival sex worker, it seems. There's some rumors of that. And so she was institutionalized. She was put into this essentially like labor farm, a working farm. Carrie was put in foster care, and she was raped in foster care, and she became pregnant. Uh-oh, what have we here? An unwed pregnant woman? How humiliating for this respectable foster family. Okay, and so Carrie was put in the same institution as her mom. She stayed there for the rest of her pregnancy. They took her infant, Vivian, from her as soon as she was born. She never saw her again. Vivian was placed with the rapist's family, okay? And based on this idea that Carrie's mom was abnormal, out of wedlock babies, and now Carrie's abnormal, out of wedlock babies, and a random social worker interacted with Vivian and like said, I know I could be biased because I know her mom's like a loose woman, you know? So maybe that's why, but I think there's something wrong with Vivian too. Bam, 3 generations of biologically unfit people. And so that was used as the basis for justifying their sterilization. There was a sham trial, and an attorney was appointed for Carrie Buck, who did not represent her interests at all. He was a straight up eugenicist. He put no argument forward on her behalf. It was a total sham. But the Supreme Court ruled on this, and they said, yeah, you can sterilize people against their will. It's good for everyone. And they probably don't even like care because they're too dumb to care. And, you know, we draft people to war and they're amazing and these people suck. So this is great and fine. The line is 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. It's like the famous line from that case. And like a horrifying fact to consider is that that case has never been overturned. Now, no state currently has a eugenic sterilization law on the bills, but they could if they wanted to. There's nothing stopping them. There's no Supreme Court precedent stopping them. They could easily do that. And in fact, we still today sterilize people against their will. You know, we say it's not eugenic. Some of it's being done extra legally, just nurses and doctors deciding. And some of it is being done under the law, right? If you're disabled and you have a guardian appointed for you, or like Britney Spears in a conservatorship, like the people who are your guardians can order for you to be sterilized. They can and do. It still happens today.
Yeah, and we also know from other discussions in this program that eugenics also not only targeted poor whites, but was fundamental in the creation of race, and the fear and horror of race mixing was paramount, and a lot of people who suffered, and we may not ever get numbers on how many African-American women and men probably were sterilized on the sole basis that they were Black.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it should be noted, right? So that early period, and where the Bucky Bell case came from, yes, the focus was really on poor whites. That shifted in a huge way. And some of that shift came along with the expansion of civil liberties for people of color, which is also like, my God. So suddenly people of color are like eligible for benefits now, and they used to not be at all. And we just hate that, don't we? Right? I mean, they say this is when welfare became unpopular, when it was a widower's pension benefit for like white war widows. We were totally into it. If it's a Black woman, no way. They're seen, again, undeserving, irresponsible. And in the South, they were so common. It was called Mississippi appendectomy. I think Fannie Lou Hamer coined that term, and she went through this experience herself. There's a notable case here that you should look up if you don't know, the Relf sisters. And it seems that one of these sisters did have some developmental delays or something. They were poor Black girls on welfare. They were told that they were getting like shots for their health. Turns out it was like an early version of Depo. Which early Depo was bad. And at one point, like the Department of Health stopped issuing Depo for that reason. And that is when they gave their mom, who could not read, a document to sign sterilizing her daughters. And that is how they got away with it. That kind of thing happened all the time. And it happens today, right? We have whistleblowers saying we're sterilizing people in ICE detention. I'm here in California. California has always been a big fan of eugenics. And, you know, just a few years ago, they got caught sterilizing incarcerated women. The LA General Hospital, there's a great documentary about them sterilizing immigrant women. So this is an ongoing problem. We are still dealing with our eugenics problem here.
Yeah, and it's difficult to, I mean, it's difficult to square that circle where when we're talking about the reproduction as creating another person, at what point does that person begin to be created? And that's up for debate and all that kind of stuff. And on one hand, we're trying to, as a society, define and regulate that. But at the same time, we're stripping other people of the ability to do it, while at the same time pushing motherhood into the background and making fetal personhood primacy, the primal relationship in this. So it's incredibly complicated. And I mean, it's not only misogynistic and racist and economically fraught, but I mean, there's a question here somewhere, but how do we get to a point where we're now looking at women and pregnant people can get pregnant as criminals in this process? I mean, I see where it comes out of sterilization, where certain people aren't worthy of it, but the people who are worthy of it, some of them aren't worthy either, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Apparently you can never be a reproducing body correctly. Apparently. Yeah. So, we had a little bit of fetal personhood kind of stuff. Even before we knew much about the fetus, we were like, some of this early labor law, right? For example, like, oh, if these women who work in the hotel work too hard and don't get paid enough, they might become whores and their babies won't be good. We better make sure we regulate working women. Like, that's interesting. Where we see the big shift, we've been doing institutions and we've been doing labor regulation. We did this a little bit in the institution of slavery as well, a little bit of maternal fetal conflict. Dorothy Roberts talks about this, where because the fetus is property, future property in an enslaved person, right? Before it's even born, it is property. And so if they were going to beat a pregnant enslaved woman, they would dig a hole in the ground big enough for her to stick her belly in to quote unquote protect that future property, right? So yeah, we see this stuff come up in the criminal system around the same time that we're amping everything up in the criminal system. And this is war on drugs stuff, right? So I think probably most people are pretty familiar with the war on drugs, right? But it's this one, we have decided that drugs are a major social issue. We got to establish that one first, right? And two, we've decided that we're going to deal with it by punishing people. There's now a lot of violence happening during this time too. The United States still has a pretty remarkably high homicide rate for a developed country, something guns. But it was really even worse then. People who are working in drug markets cannot call the police to enforce contracts and such. And so, right, if you are working in these informal markets, sometimes violence is the way you enforce stuff. We decided instead of public health, instead of social services, instead of remedying poverty, we're going to put people in cages. And we got into this in a big way, probably the biggest way, when it came to crack cocaine. Crack was really interesting as a drug because it is smokable, and women are much more likely to use drugs that they can smoke, apparently. And so, yeah, crack was a drug. In general, men tend to use more drugs than women do, but crack was a drug that a lot of women were using. It was cheap, and it would give you a really quick, really good high, and you didn't need much of it to do it. And some doctors started noticing some things. So there's this doctor, his name is Ira Chasnoff. He was the first, and he was in Chicago. He was looking at just a small group of babies that had been born to moms that did use crack while they were pregnant. And he was noticing that they were small and trembly, and some of them were premature. And so he wrote this article that was very preliminary. I mean, he hedged everything, right? Small n. I'm just observing, no causation here, right? But when that paper came out, there was a major panic about it. And your listeners probably have heard of crack babies before too. Maybe you haven't, and I think that's great. But yes, they created this idea of the crack baby that was really not supported by the research at all. But the idea is that if someone uses crack cocaine, and only crack, not powder cocaine, why would that be? That it produces unique, lifelong damage. And the way that these children were described is horrifying, like zombie hordes. Like I compare them to, that these were children who would be inherently violent, non-productive, couldn't learn things, would never be able to have a job, expensive in the ER, and their moms can't afford to pay the medical bills. So they're really building up this idea that like these bad drug user women are having hordes of bad babies that will ruin America, and we have to pay for it. Well, we better get to punishing. And so that's what we did. In this first period of where we see big numbers in the criminalization of pregnancy after Roe v. Wade is during this crack panic. South Carolina was very active during this time, and looking at the people they arrested, almost every single one of them was a Black woman who was tested. They decided to test people. Who will they test? How will they decide? Race is an element there, right? Either intentionally or unintentionally, it is. We know that everybody uses drugs, so it doesn't make sense that they would only be finding Black women testing positive for drugs, right? But yeah, the one white woman that was targeted during that period, it was written on her medical record by a very racist nurse who developed this testing program that her partner was Black. But she used a slur and she wrote it on the medical records. Incredible. That's sort of our starting point. So mid 80s, we get going really hard with the criminalization of pregnancy.
Yeah, and it reminded me of, I read in another book, in another interview, that there used to be white women who would go into hospitals and determine which race your baby was based on how dark they were. And it was because they were so afraid, these white women were so afraid of Black people passing as white. And it goes, so there's a through line from the eugenics that we were just talking about to the creation of this racial system into the drug war. And the crack cocaine was a fantastic explanation in your book. And I think it's worth noting that none of it came to pass. So we're now almost 30 years on, and these crack babies didn't become the zombie hordes that we were told they were going to be.
Yeah, we have proof now. There have been so many studies, and like a great study came out when I was just learning about this in my PhD programs. It's so exciting to learn. Yeah, they looked at children who were exposed in utero to crack. They're like my age. They're like, mid to late 30s now. Poverty is the predictor. Crack is not the predictor.
Worse, yeah.
Yeah, kids who were exposed to crack are like pretty fine. There are, some maybe delays that we're still not quite positive on the causal thing there. But yeah, what Dr. Chasnoff was seeing in these babies wasn't crack exposure. He was seeing poverty. He was seeing lack of prenatal care. He was seeing probably use of a lot of different substances, including alcohol and cigarettes usually. Maybe no access to good food or housing or even water, right? A lot of things contribute to a pregnancy. Some of those things are in our control and some of them are not. We've proven now poverty is the thing. So if you really, really care about these healthy babies and you don't want to ruin America, we should probably do something about the poverty thing.
Well, and I do want to jump the racial divide into how this epidemic of drug addicted babies has continued today with the fentanyl, oxycodone. The poor whites have now again become the focus of some of this policing and punishment. And it's the exact same way that it happened with the crack mothers, but now it's happening in rural, primarily white communities. So would you talk about what's going on more recently than just what happened in the past?
Yeah. So it is an interesting story. So, okay, mid to late 80s, we're freaking out about crack. We're developing programs to surveil, test, right? Counties are trying stuff out and learning from one another. And sometimes it's just like one guy, like one prosecutor or one social worker or one nurse. And then they go to the state whoever meeting and tell everyone about the thing they're doing, and it spreads, changes, shifts, but a lot of the rhetoric stays the same. And so after South Carolina, I looked at Alabama. Alabama passed a law in 2006 called chemical endangerment of a minor. It's a new crime that they created, and they created this law because they were panicking about a new drug. Well, not new, but a new panic about an old drug, a drug that a lot of doctors and lawyers and Air Force pilots use regularly to do their jobs well. Yeah, they were having a meth panic. And particularly, they were worried about, if any of you have seen Breaking Bad, I'm sure I coded a lot of this data with Breaking Bad playing in the background. But this image of specifically a trailer park meth lab. They were very concerned about infants, children in these spaces where, Walter White always puts on his gas mask and his goggles. You don't want to be breathing that air. It's not safe. So they made a new criminal law. If you have a child in an environment where drugs are used or manufactured, or it's pretty broad, actually, if there's drug paraphernalia, if there are drug precursors, ingredients you could use to make drugs, in an environment, that's the word they use, where there's a child, it's a felony. If the child is totally fine, it's a Class C felony. If the child dies, it's a Class A felony and you could go to prison for the rest of your life. So now that law doesn't say anything about babies or about fetuses, about pregnancy, nothing. There's nothing there. And for some reason, a prosecutor thought, I could use that chemical endangerment law. There's these women who are testing positive for meth when they go to give birth. We could use that chemical endangerment law, maybe, right? Maybe we could put some teeth. The way they explained it was like, these social workers and doctors have a problem, and they can't get these women to stop using drugs. And so maybe if we threaten them a little bit, that could, quote unquote, encourage them. Now, that's not what the evidence tells us about best practices for getting people to stop using drugs. But that's what they decided they wanted to do. They referred to it as like a velvet hammer instead of like a regular hammer that they'll just like smash into you with. So yeah, they started using that law. They arrested hundreds of people with like a very shaky legal basis. And they get away with doing this because they are almost always impoverished people, not a lot of resources. Maybe they get a public defender who has no time to work on their case. And in some cases, the public defenders are just as angry at them as everybody else. They usually take a plea bargain instead of challenging the charges on their legal basis. And that happened a bunch of times. It went to the Alabama Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was like, you know what? You're right. In fact, we're going to take it further than any prosecutor did. It's not just going to be like if you give birth to a baby and the baby tests positive for drugs. It's going to be if you do anything that could harm your pregnancy from the moment of conception, you have committed a felony. There's a caveat for abortion that lasts for a couple of years, but that's gone now. So they really went all out with meth. And then the most recent sort of iteration of this has been opioids. And Tennessee was my kind of case study for this. Tennessee passed a law specifically in response to the opioid epidemic, which is a widespread common drug problem, whereas crack and meth tended to be a little bit more isolated and concentrated. Opioids tend to be associated with working class white people. I often think of like construction worker injured on the job. And so, I mean, the response to opioids has been interesting. There has been a lot of great critique, especially about the kind of race elements here that, oh, it's working white people, like it's not white trash and it's not Black people, it's working white people. Like maybe they deserve some sympathy. Maybe this is a health issue, not a you're a bad person issue. And so, yeah, we've been seeing this more public health oriented approach. We need to expand treatment, make it accessible. We need to hold these drug companies, accountable for what they've done. Unfortunately, that has not extended down to the people who are pregnant. It seems that our hatred for pregnant people and our like very unrealistic expectations for pregnant people is overriding some of that whiteness, that like protective coating of whiteness. There's still a lot of disdain. We kind of revert back to the old punishment stuff when they're pregnant, it would seem. I think we expect you're pregnant, and so you have like biological swell of maternal love that will like make you not go through withdrawals. It would be cool, because I think a lot of moms who use drugs and want to stop, that would be really cool. But unfortunately, that's just not reality.
And I want to kind of end on this idea of how, because I think it's a really well used term in your book, which is the pregnancy police. Who are they? What do they do? And after everything we've talked about, who are the people on the ground making these? We've talked about some of them, prosecutors, law enforcement, those kind of people. But let's talk about healthcare. How is healthcare involved in this process? Because it seems like healthcare should be doing everything it can to reduce harm, all the stuff that we expect medicine to do isn't necessarily what it's doing, right?
Yeah. I feel like I keep listing like horrifying fact number 5. But like, yeah, horrifying fact number 5. If you are going to be prosecuted for a crime against your own pregnancy, about 75% of the time, it's going to happen because a healthcare provider reported you. Now, medical privacy, question mark. Is that a thing that we get to have? It's pretty well established that competent adults do have a right to medical privacy. The only exceptions there are, if you are found to be an imminent threat of harm to yourself or somebody else. So, generally speaking, if you fail a drug test, that's a negative way of putting it. If you test positive on a drug test and your nurse calls the cops on you, your nurse is going to get in trouble. Seemingly not the case for pregnancy. And my next kind of big project, I want to figure out what is happening here. We know that some hospitals have protocols to decide who to test, when to report. And we also know that some hospitals are just making it up. Some hospitals will not release these policies. They won't even tell people what their policies are, which I think is like, that's pretty bananas. You should be able to know. Now, some doctors, they're doing this because they think they have to. This is a misinterpretation of a few laws on the books, HIPAA and CAPTA being the two big ones. You do not have to interpret drug use as child abuse, and you do not have to report it, period. And I have not seen a single case of a healthcare provider getting in trouble for not reporting it. I have to imagine that there are healthcare providers who are maybe working at hospitals or in states where they're supposed to, quote unquote, where they're being told they're supposed to. I have to imagine that not all of them are okay with it. So, as a workaround, just any doctors or nurses listening, not legal advice, but a fact to know, we have not discovered a case of them getting in trouble yet. So unfortunately, what this means in practice is that we need to be careful what information we disclose to our healthcare providers. And we need to be very careful about like everything that we're signing when we go into those spaces. You want to read that stuff. If you're having a medical crisis, maybe bring a friend that is not in a crisis that can read it for you. Because yeah, they are not protecting our privacy. And when you ask who the pregnancy police are, sort of like, who aren't they? Like you and I are like maybe the pregnancy police sometimes, or maybe have been, right? These are the people who surveil and report, prosecute, and control folks for crimes against their pregnancies. And so in practice, this is, yes, often originating with a healthcare provider, but social workers are very important here. Of course, the regular police are in on it too, right? Prosecutors are in on it, but also your neighbor or your friend or your coworker, any of these people, right? I mean, if you've ever found in your own mind, like, oh my God, she's pregnant and she is lifting heavy weights. Oh my God. Like you're sort of doing it too when you have those. And I've had those thoughts before. I think a lot of us do. We have separate and different standards for people who are pregnant. We expect so much more of them than is like realistic for human beings. And we're so judgy about it. So, we could all be the pregnancy police. I know a lot of people are worried, like, how do I avoid getting quote unquote caught? If they decide I've done something wrong, how do I protect myself? And one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give you is you've got to be careful who you talk to. And that's terrible. Like, I don't like that reality. I want to tell everybody about like, oh, my abortion was great and it was fine. I think we should be able to be open and honest. That's how we break stigma. But also in 100% of these cases, they are catching people because a human tells on them. They're not doing, we're going to flag everyone who uses a period tracker app or everyone who visited a Planned Parenthood gets an investigation. No, they'll look at that stuff maybe after someone has reported you. And so we need to be very, very careful with that information. Do not tell people about your crimes, even if you think they shouldn't be crimes. Okay.
Right. Don't snitch on yourself.
Don't snitch on yourself, man. And like, hey, don't snitch on your friend either. Like, right? Like, don't be a pregnancy police. You can say no to being a pregnancy police.
Yeah, and I think we should probably wrap it up with reproductive justice, because that gives us an out of this conversation that is workable, and it's not only theoretical, but it can be adapted into a structure that challenges some of the stuff that we were just talking about.
Absolutely, yeah. So reproductive justice is a theoretical framework that was developed by women of color, primarily Black women. And they developed this in response to the kind of mainstream abortion rights activists' pro-choice framework. So, if we're limiting it to the pro-choice framework, we basically got two issues to think about. Are we doing abortions or not? Okay. Is it legal to have abortions or not? That's it. Reproductive justice says, like, yeah, abortion's important. People should be able to have them. Legality is not enough to get us there, right? Something can be legal and completely inaccessible. And when Roe was still on the books, abortion was inaccessible to many people. Reproductive justice also says, though, what if we care about things including abortion? We should probably be thinking about those things, because these are things, yes, middle-class white ladies, maybe abortion is the hurdle, or contraception, access to that is the hurdle that you've had. But we're out here being sterilized against our will. We're out here having our children stolen from us, right? We're out here watching our babies getting killed in the streets by cops. And we have infants that are drinking water with lead in it. Okay. So What if instead of this, like, can we do it or not, we have a much bigger conversation? So there are three tenets. Sometimes people articulate a fourth that is fun, and I like to include. One, reproductive justice says you have the right to have children. That means fertility treatments should be available to you. You should be able to choose how and where you give birth, right? All of these kinds of things. You shouldn't be sterilized against your will. Two, you have the right to not have children. And that means we need to help you access those things. So that is like sex ed, that is contraceptives, that is abortion on demand without apology, all of that kind of stuff. Sterilization if you want it. And then the third tenet is that you have the right to raise your children. So that means we're not going to steal your children, right? That means we're not going to kill your children. And that means like we will give you what you need to raise your children well. It's hard to raise your children well if you're struggling to survive every day, right? The fourth tenet is you've got the right to separate sex from reproduction. Just say that out loud, because this is the reality too. Most of the time when people have sex, they're not trying to make a baby, and that is okay. Like, that's an okay thing. Like, sexual pleasure is important and can be like a liberating, positive thing. So those are the four basic tenets. And reproductive justice, I think, by having this much broader conversation, it not only gets us, I think, past this sort of artificial, are we going to do it or not conversation, where we're not digging into like, well, why are people making certain choices and what choices are available? It also, I think, opens the door to coalition building in a way that's not present with the choice framework. Because now we have to talk about police violence, and we have to talk about housing equality, and we have to talk about income, right? We have to talk about war. We have to talk about, yeah, abortion law. Like, all of it comes to the table. And I think if all of us bring our interests together under the reproductive justice framework, we could change the world.